Tonight, you're not planning resolutions or counting the year you should have had. You are standing in a quieter place, right at the edge of a winter street where the calendar is supposed to behave, and people don't always cooperate. 3 small senses to keep you company. A winter window hums with that thin electrical cold. Church bells pause between hours, like they're deciding whether to announce midnight or pretend it never arrived. And footsteps soften on snow until even moving feels like whispering. If your breathing starts to match that softness perfect, inhale 4, exhale 6. And before we step any closer to the forbidden part of this night, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Because you might not expect the calendar page to get anyone in trouble, but for a long time it could. Not because the numbers were dangerous. Not because midnight is sharp. Just because people, when given a fresh year, tend to behave like they've been handed a small, temporary permission slip. A permission to drink a little louder, to sing a little longer, to gamble with coins or with pride, and to treat tomorrow like a negotiable concept. Authorities noticed, and they disliked how quickly celebration turns strangers into a crowd, and a crowd turns the street into a place where class lines blur, rules feel optional, and the city's mood stops asking for approval. So, in many places, New Year's wasn't treated as harmless fun. It was treated as a doorway. A doorway for noise that didn't stay politely indoors. A doorway for drinking that started social and ended historical. A doorway for sudden fights that were less about hatred and more about the old human sport of bumping into someone in a narrow lane and deciding it was fate. If you listen closely, you can hear why the law feared it. Not only the shouting, but the way time itself becomes the party's main ingredient. When the clocks get involved, the night feels like it has permission. And once a night feels permitted, it becomes harder to manage with tidy sentences and clean uniforms. If nights like this are your kind of quiet history where power shows up wearing rules instead of armor, you can subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy this pace. I post more long, sleep-friendly stories like this, where we let the details do the work and keep the tone calm. And if you leave a comment telling me where and what time you're listening from, I'll read a few and pin one, so this midnight has a little roll call of its own. Because tonight's story isn't really about fireworks or champagne. It's about something more intimate. Who gets to own midnight? Who gets to decide what a new year even means? And what happens when people keep celebrating anyway, small, stubborn, and quiet enough to slip past the patrols. Reform movements often treated festive nights as suspicious, especially when they smelled like older, improper customs. If celebration looked like superstition, it could be framed as moral decay rather than community tradition. It is a very efficient trick. Call something disorder, and suddenly shutting it down sounds like virtue. In some eras, authorities pushed plain living, quieter streets, and stricter Sundays, and the party night became an easy target. You can feel the tone of it in the language of piety becoming policy, where the goal is not just to stop a specific activity, but to change what the city thinks is normal. The ideal citizen becomes someone who does not gather in large numbers after dark, does not sing loudly, and does not treat midnight like an event. The ideal citizen, in other words, is asleep already. And it wasn't only religious reformers. Civic leaders also had practical worries, the kind that sound boring until you imagine them happening at once. Fires, broken windows, stolen purses. The problem of too many people trying to pass through the same narrow streets at the same time, which is basically ancient crowd management, and still not fully solved. The night pulled servants and apprentices into the same spaces as their employers. It pulled the respectable into proximity with the rowdy. It made everyone briefly equal under the same dark sky. And equality is one of those concepts that can feel inspiring when you're writing poetry, and alarming when you're writing laws. So how do you ban a midnight? Exactly. You can't arrest a clock. You can't put handcuffs on December. The simplest ban is a curfew: close the taverns early, patrol the squares, and make gathering feel risky. Some cities used fines, raids, and public warnings because embarrassment can be cheaper than prisons. And officials learned to target the tools of celebration, the little objects that turn a quiet evening into an event. Fireworks, drums, drink, even masks. Especially masks, because a mask makes a person feel anonymous. And anonymous people behave as if the world is a stage and they have no assigned seat. There are old records in various places of watchmen and patrols trying to manage late-night movement with a mixture of authority and exhaustion. You can imagine the tone. Someone in a heavy coat, holding a lantern, telling a cheerful drunk that home is a public safety policy. Curfews don't have to be dramatic to work. They just have to be consistent. And they work best when the streets are quiet enough that the law can pretend the calendar has no heartbeat. A silent city makes the band look successful, even if the silence is simply everyone celebrating indoors, whispering like children with contraband candy. Sometimes enforcement was also strangely theatrical, confiscating noisemakers, breaking up gatherings, ordering doors shut. In some places and periods, rules against late-night revelry were bundled with rules against gambling, public intoxication, and disorderly behavior, which is a flexible category that can expand to include basically any laughter you don't approve of. It's the kind of category that can swallow a holiday without having to name it. The law doesn't say no New Year. It says no unnecessary noise, and then quietly decides what counts as necessary. Spoiler, very little. And then there's the deeper move, changing what New Year even means. Shifting dates, redefining what counts as legitimate time. A new calendar isn't just math. It's a statement that the old rhythm of life is over. When leaders choose a new starting point for the year, they are not merely adjusting paperwork. They are announcing ownership. In different places, different dates have been treated as the real turning of the year, and the transition has not always been smooth. People keep celebrating the old midnight anyway, because habit is loyal, and because the body remembers seasons better than decrees. This is where the conflict becomes less about one holiday and more about who owns time itself. If the year used to begin in spring, or on a religious feast, or on a ruler's preferred schedule, then the choice of January 1st is not neutral. It's a decision, and decisions about time are quietly powerful, because time tells you when to work, when to rest, when to pay rent, when to forgive debts, and when to pretend you will start exercising. When you tell a population the year begins here, you're also telling them your promises begin here. Which is why celebrating at the wrong time can feel like a small act of defiance, even when the defiance includes nothing more radical than a drink and a song sung slightly too late. So people adjusted. They did what people always do when a rule tries to control something private and natural. They moved the celebration, they softened it, they made it harder to see. When public celebration is banned, the party often goes indoors and becomes smaller, quieter, and more personal. A candle becomes a countdown. A shared drink becomes a ritual. A whispered song replaces a street parade. There's something very human about this. If you can't have a loud joy, you build a quiet one and insist it still counts. In some communities, there were also watch nights, gatherings that stayed up until midnight with a serious face, as if staying awake was acceptable as long as you looked morally tired. It's a clever compromise. You get to mark the moment, but you frame it as devotion or reflection or anything that sounds like it could be approved by a committee. Even when the mood is warm, the language is careful. People learn to celebrate without evidence because the safest festivity is the one that leaves no trace. And yet the meaning can grow stronger precisely because it is forbiddance. A private toast can feel heavier than a public parade, not because it is more important, but because it required planning, and humans tend to romanticize planning. Families invent polite cover stories, late dinners, just visiting, harmless gatherings that look ordinary from the outside. Small customs become code, a certain food, a certain phrase, a knock at the door at the right hour, a tray of sweets that appears only in winter, a particular drink poured into cups that are used for no other occasion. Even the act of staying awake can become a signal, like a tiny lantern in the window that says, without saying, "Yes, we know what time it is. Yes, we are still here. No, we are not causing trouble, unless you count soft singing as trouble, in which case we are absolutely criminals." And it's strangely comforting to think of all the quiet improvisations. The holiday survives by becoming subtle. It becomes pocket-sized. It turns into something you can carry in your body rather than display in the street. The rhythm of it is small, a breath, a clink of glass, a shared look toward a clock that is pretending not to be watched. If you've ever tried to open a snack quietly at night so no one hears you, you already understand most of the technique. History is full of people eating metaphorical chips in the dark. Over time, bans start to feel pointless. For the same reason most strict rules do, enforcement gets tired. Priorities shift. Officials discover you can't patrol every home at midnight. A ban that's widely ignored becomes embarrassing because it proves the state is not fully in control. And the law dislikes losing, so rules soften, exceptions appear. The holiday slowly walks back into public life, not because the law suddenly loves joy, but because it prefers a controlled version of joy to an uncontrolled one. A regulated celebration is still a celebration, but it's also a schedule. And schedules are comforting to authorities. Sometimes the return is gradual and practical. Taverns get later hours. Noise rules become selectively enforced. Fireworks become permitted in certain places, on certain nights, at certain times, as if celebration can be domesticated by a permit. The calendar is allowed to have a heartbeat again, but only a polite one. And even then, someone is always trying to keep it reasonable, which is a funny word to apply to a night built around the idea of time changing in an instant. Reasonable midnight, responsible cheer, controlled excitement. It's like trying to make a storm behave because you handed it a pamphlet. And in the end, the strangest part is that the moment itself was never the threat. The year turns whether you clap or not. The danger from the perspective of the night authorities was the communal feeling that comes with it. The feeling that you can start again. The feeling that you can forgive yourself. The feeling that you can forgive other people, which is even more destabilizing because grudges are such reliable social glue. A Forbidden's Midnight is, in its quiet way, a reminder that celebration can be political without shouting, simply by continuing. So imagine the last minute of a year as a quiet room rather than a loud street, because that's how it often survived. One small toast, one shared breath, one promise to wake up and try again. The promise doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be as dull as promising to write things down more neatly, or to stop losing buttons, or to finally learn what day it is without checking. The clock turns, the city exhales, and somewhere, whether the night is allowed or not, the new year arrives anyway, soft-footed, a little cold, and completely indifferent to the rules written about it. You might not expect the last night of the year to be treated like a suspicious object, but it often was. Not the year itself, of course. The year is just a number that quietly changes its outfit while nobody is looking. The problem was the human habit of noticing. The problem was that people hear New Year and immediately begin behaving as if the universe has opened a fresh notebook and handed them a clean page. Even if they're reholding that page with sticky fingers in a mug that smells like something fermented on purpose. A winter window hums. The glass holds a mild, steady cold. Somewhere, church bells pause between hours as if they're waiting for permission. Footsteps soften on snow. And if you feel like answering in a whisper, you barely have to commit to where are you listening from. And what time is it for you right now? The first thing to understand is that in many places, New Year's wasn't seen as harmless fun. It was seen as a doorway. Not a magical doorway, a practical one. A doorway for drinking that started as just warming up and ended as accidentally reorganizing your entire personality. A doorway for noise that moved from one street to the next like a rumor with legs. A doorway for gambling that insisted it was only about pennies, and then quietly tried to swallow someone's coat, someone's ring, or someone's dignity, whichever was easiest to misplace. And a doorway for sudden fights that weren't even heroic or dramatic, just the sort of small collision you get when too many bodies are trying to share the same narrow street at the same time. Officials notice something else too, something that sounds almost philosophical when you say it slowly. The night blurred lines, class lines mostly. A crowd makes everyone look like part of the same species. And for a city that relies on everyone staying politely in their assigned layers, that can feel like a tiny earthquake. Strangers turn into a group turns into a crowd, and a crowd makes tomorrow feel negotiable, like it's a soft substance you can stretch, and daylight tomorrow has edges. It has appointments, it has rules, but at midnight tomorrow is still forming, and people treat it like fresh dough. Not to be too poetic about dough, but it's surprisingly political. If you're still awake by the time we reach the idea of a curfew for joy, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Honestly, don't strain yourself. The night authorities of the past didn't have to ask for engagement. They simply wrote a rule and then acted disappointed when humans continued to be human, which is a traditional form of disappointment. And once you start reading old complaints about festive nights, you realize how often they sound like someone reviewing a restaurant they didn't choose to enter. Too loud, too crowded, too much laughter, not enough respect for the concept of bedtime. In certain eras, especially where reform movements were trying to scrub society into something plain and orderly, festive nights were treated as suspicious, especially when they smelled like older customs. The smell mattered. The smell of drink, yes, but also the smell of tradition. Something old can be framed as superstition. Something communal can be framed as disorder. If celebration looked like an inherited habit, authorities could label it improper, which is a flexible word that fits almost anything you don't personally enjoy. And then once it's framed that way, shutting it down sounds like virtue. It becomes piety. It becomes public order. It becomes a necessary correction, said in the same tone you'd use for correcting a crooked painting. You can feel the logic. If you can regulate the night, you can regulate the mood of a city. The calendar becomes a lever. And the ban is rarely just about dates. It is about obedience. It's the state whispering calmly and firmly that even the turning of the year is not entirely yours, which is a strangely intimate claim. Imagine someone telling you they don't just want to manage your taxes, they also want to manage your sigh of relief at midnight. They want the sigh to be quieter. They want it scheduled. They want it to come with a receipt. And then there are the practical complaints, which are always less romantic but more persuasive in meetings. Late night crowds mean more accidents, more fires, more broken windows, more lost property, more confusion about who started what. When you put enough people in a tight space with cold air and warm drink, the city becomes a kind of slow-motion experiment. Add torches, candles, and fireworks, and you've built a festive machine that occasionally produces smoke and apologies. So officials tried to reduce the variables. They did what you do when you can to stop time. You try to stop the gathering around time. This is where the ban becomes a method. The simplest method is a curfew. Close the taverns early, patrol the squares, make gathering feel risky. If the streets are quiet, the law can pretend the calendar has no heartbeat. And curfews have a special power because they don't have to win every time. They just have to be present. A patrol doesn't need to arrest everyone. It only needs to be seen. Seen and therefore imagined. The mind does the rest. People start planning around the possibility of trouble. They bring the party inside. They make the noise smaller. They learn the art of celebration with soft edges. Sometimes cities use fines, raids, public warnings, and that wonderfully cheap tool, embarrassment. A public warning is like a little billboard of authority. It tells you you're being watched, and it tells your neighbors you might be the type of person who needs watching, which is its own kind of punishment. And officials learn to target the tools of celebration, because tools are easier to confiscate than feelings. Drums, noisemakers, fireworks, masks, even certain kinds of public. Drinking vessels, depending on the place and the mood of the law that week. It is much easier to seize a drum than to seize the human urge to mark a boundary between one year and the next. Picture it slowly, the way it probably felt in real time. A watchman in a heavy coat, carrying a lantern, stepping through a street that smells like cold stone and old wood. He hears laughter behind a door. He pauses. Not because he's brave, but because it's his job to pause. He knocks. The laughter quiets. Someone inside whispers, "Don't answer," as if the door itself is an instrument that might betray them. Another whisper says, "Just say we're visiting," and suddenly the party becomes an exercise in plausible deniability, which is not exactly festive, but it is strangely creative. And then there is the deeper move, changing what New Year even means. If you can't fully stop a celebration, you can try to move it, shift dates, redefine what counts as legitimate time. A new calendar isn't just math, it's a statement. It says the old rhythm is over. It says the state or the church or the ruler has decided where the year begins, and therefore where certain obligations begin too, and this is not small. The first day of the year is not just a day, it's a filing system. It's the start of accounts, rents, contracts, promises, and the annual human tradition of declaring, with great confidence, that this time will be different. In different places, people have marked the new year at different times. Spring, autumn, religious feasts, local traditions. And when authorities tried to standardize, it could feel like someone rearranging the furniture in your house and insisting it's better now, even if you keep walking into the table because your body still remembers where it used to be. People keep celebrating the old midnight anyway because habit is loyal and because the body understands seasons better than decrees. A decree can be read once and forgotten. A season returns and taps you on the shoulder every year. So the struggle becomes less about one holiday and more about who owns time itself. If the year begins on a certain date, then the promise of starting over is also pinned to that date. That promise is emotionally useful. It makes people behave. It makes people hope. It makes people forgive debts, or at least forgive themselves, which can be even more dangerous in the eyes of strict moral systems. And if people gather around that promise without permission, then permission itself starts to look optional. That's the quiet fear, not the shouting. The optionalness. This is why even a small celebration can look like a crack in the wall. Because once a crowd learns that the wall is not absolute, the crowd begins to imagine other walls. And imagination, historically, has been a nuisance to authority. Not always a heroic nuisance. Sometimes a nuisance that results in someone singing off-key at midnight, but still, a nuisance. So what did people do very calmly under these rules? They adapted. They did the gentle indoor version. When public celebration is banned, the party often goes inside and becomes smaller, softer, more personal. A candle becomes a countdown. A shared drink becomes a ritual. A whispered song replaces a street parade. The meaning shifts. It grows quieter, but sometimes deeper, because secrecy has a way of making ordinary things feel important. You can turn almost anything into a sacred object if you hide it long enough, even a piece of cake, even a small toast, even the act of staying awake. And people develop techniques the way humans always do when they have to keep doing something without being noticed. They learn to celebrate without evidence because the safest festivity is the one that leaves no trace. No obvious noise, no visible crowd, no easy target. If you had fireworks, you didn't use them. Or you saved them for a moment when the wind was loud enough to cover the sound, which is the kind of planning that looks ridiculous until you remember that history is full of people planning around wind. There were also the serious-looking alternatives, which are almost funny in their own quiet way. Some communities leaned into solemn gatherings, watch nights, prayer meetings, reflective services, anything that allowed people to be awake together at midnight while wearing an expression of moral responsibility. It's a brilliant disguise, really. You get the communal moment, you get the transition, and you wrap it in language that sounds approved. You can almost hear it. We are not partying. We are contemplating. And then someone contemplates a second cup of warm drink because contemplation is thirsty work. Families invented cover stories that were so ordinary they became code. Late dinners. A cousin just visiting, said with the practiced innocence of someone who is visiting extremely hard. Small customs become signals. A certain food made only on that night because food is an excellent hiding place for tradition. A particular phrase whispered at the door, a knock at the right hour. A candle in a window, small enough to look like nothing to a passerby, but meaningful enough to someone who knows. What was once loud turns into something careful, like a tradition carried in the pocket. And because humans love routine, even secret routines become steady. The holiday survives by becoming subtle. It becomes portable. It turns into a thing you can carry inside your own body rather than display in the street. If you've ever tried to open a snack quietly at night so you don't wake anyone, you already understand the basic emotional posture. You're still doing the thing. You're just doing it in a softer key. And in that softness, it sometimes becomes even more stubborn. Of course, enforcement doesn't stay sharp forever. It gets tired. Priorities shift. Officials discover, slowly and repeatedly, that you can't patrol every home at midnight. A ban that's widely ignored becomes embarrassing because it proves the state is not fully in control. And the law dislikes losing. So over time, rules soften, exceptions appear. The holiday slowly walks back into public life, not because the law suddenly loves joy, but because the law prefers a controlled version of joy to an uncontrolled one. Regulated celebration is still celebration, but it's also a schedule. And schedules are comforting to institutions the way blankets are comforting to humans. Sometimes the return looks bureaucratic. Permits, approved times, approved locations, a certain number of hours where noise is allowed, and then it must be packed away like a chair after a meeting. Fireworks become legal in designated areas, which is a very modern-sounding sentence for something that has been argued about for a long time. Taverns get later hours, or at least less aggressive closing. Patrols become more symbolic. Or they focus on truly dangerous behavior rather than the general crime of being awake and cheerful. And when the holiday returns, it returns changed. People remember the indoor version. They remember the quiet codes. They remember the private rituals. Even if the streets become loud again, the idea that celebration can survive without permission stays in the background. It becomes a kind of cultural muscle memory, a reminder that time will turn whether you clap or not, whether you are allowed or not, whether you are watched or not. So imagine the last minute of the year as a quiet room rather than a loud street, because that is, for many people, how it survived. One small toast, one shared breath, one promise that doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be something boring and therefore sustainable, like promising to write your name more neatly, or to stop losing your gloves, or to finally learn the difference between a resolution and a wish. The promise can be gentle enough that it doesn't wake the house. The clock turns, the city exhales. And the band Midnight arrives anyway, soft-footed, a little cold, and completely indifferent to whatever rule was supposed to stop it. You might not expect a loaf of bread to come with rules, fines, and a kind of quiet municipal anxiety, but in a lot of medieval towns, it absolutely did. Bread was not just food. Bread was math you could chew. Bread was wages made visible. Bread was the one thing a city could not afford to let get mysteriously smaller, because people notice when their dinner has been edited down. And so, in the most bedtime-friendly way possible, the loaf became a small, warm object carrying the weight of law, literally and emotionally, and sometimes also physically if someone was having a very bread-heavy year. Imagine a street before dawn when the air is cold enough to feel clean. A bakery smells awake before the baker is fully awake. Flour dust sits on the wooden table like a pale fog that decided to take a nap. The ovens breathe out heat slowly, as if they're trying not to disturb the neighborhood. And somewhere nearby, a bell or a watchman's call marks the hour with the gentle confidence of someone who does not personally have to bake anything. If you feel like whispering it just for fun, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? In a medieval city, bread was a problem that never stopped being relevant. You could have fancy politics, royal marriages, dramatic sermons, and somebody in a corner would still be worrying about the price of grain, because grain prices wiggle. Grain harvests fail. Grain gets hoarded. Grain gets moved. Grain gets taxed. And then the loaf, which is supposed to be a calm, predictable rectangle of comfort, starts behaving like a tiny economic weather report. When wheat becomes expensive, the loaf should not simply stay the same size, because bakers would go broke. But if the loaf shrinks too much, people go angry. And angry people are famously loud and not at all as friendly. So towns tried to solve it the way towns solve many things, by writing it down and calling it order. In England, one famous approach was the Assize of Bread and Ale, which is a title that sounds like a folk band, but is actually a system for regulating the size and price of bread in relation to grain prices. It's hard to overstate how soothingly bureaucratic this is. Imagine your city council looking at the cost of wheat and then deciding very calmly how heavy a penny loaf should be today. Not as a suggestion, as a rule. As if bread is a public service and the loaf is basically a small, edible ordinance. There is something quietly funny about the idea that a baker estate might involve not only kneading and heat and timing, but also compliance. Like the baker is baking, but also performing spreadsheet work with fire. The loaf becomes a standard unit of trust. And the public, understandably, begins to treat the loaf like a contract. If you hand over your coin, you expect your weight. You expect your fullness. You expect the bread to be honest in the way only bread can be soft, warm, and not secretly missing a corner. If you're still awake by the time we start talking about official bread inspectors, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. Medieval officials had plenty of people awake, walking around with important faces, taking notes about things that could have been a simple conversation. That was, in many ways, their hobby. Once you decide bread is regulated, you need a system. And systems, as always, require paperwork, or at least a person who looks like paperwork. Some towns had officers whose job included checking weights and measures. Scales mattered. Standard weights mattered. The town might keep official weights, little lumps of metal that represent what a pound should be today, in a world where even reality feels negotiable. A baker selling short weight could be treated not as someone having a bad day, but as someone violating the peace. And the peace in a medieval town was a fragile thing held together by routine, religion, and the consistent size of carbs. The rules weren't only about punishment, though punishment does tend to get remembered. They were also a kind of prevention. If everyone knows the loaf size will adjust with grain prices, there's less room for rumor to grow teeth. Because rumor loves bread. Rumor loves any daily object that people can compare and complain about. If the loaf is smaller, rumor says the baker is cheating. If the loaf is larger, rumor says the baker is cheating in a different direction, possibly with sorcery. So the assize tries to make the loaf predictable, and predictability is, in its own way, a form of bedtime comfort. And yet, predictability is difficult when you are dealing with wheat, weather, and human temptation. Bakers had to work within margins that were not always kind. Flour quality varied. Ovens varied. Fuel cost money. Labor cost money. Time costs money. And sometimes the town expects you to produce affordable bread while also paying for the fact that wood is expensive and your apprentice is eating the profits in the form of testing the product, which is a very traditional problem. The product keeps disappearing and everyone insists it is for quality control. So officials inspected, they compared, they weighed. They wrote down numbers with the slow seriousness of someone who believes a decimal could prevent a riot. And the punishments, when they appeared, were meant to teach. Fines, yes. Confiscation, sometimes. Public shame, often, because public shame is cheap and reusable. In some places, bakers who repeatedly sold underweight bread could be pilloried, which is a form of punishment that is basically the medieval version of being permanently tagged in the most humiliating group photo imaginable. It's not subtle. It's not relaxing. But the idea behind it was, if the loaf cheats the people should get to stare at the baker while remembering the taste of disappointment. And the odd thing is, even the threat of punishment reveals how central bread was. Nobody is putting someone in public shame furniture over a slightly inconsistent pastry. Not usually. Bread was the daily baseline. Bread was what the poor depended on most intensely. Bread prices could trigger unrest precisely because bread is not a luxury. Bread is the quiet engine of survival. And survival is the one theme that never fully leaves human history, even when we try to narrate it gently. Now, because this is a bedtime series, we'll keep the tone soft. So instead of focusing on fear, we'll focus on the strange, mildly absurd details of enforcement. Like the fact that the regulation often included not just bread, but ale. Because if you think about it, bread and ale are both grain transformed into comfort. They are cousins. And towns had strong opinions about both. There are stories, some more legendary than strictly proven, about ale tasters, who supposedly tested whether a brewer had watered down ale by sitting on a bench with ale poured on it, wearing leather trousers, and seeing if they stuck. It is either a real method, a myth, or a practical joke that refused to die. Either way, it's the kind of detail that makes you pause and think. Humanity has always been like this, and that is oddly soothing. But even without sticky trousers, the idea remains. Officials tried to keep basic necessities within a narrow zone of fairness. The city didn't want to manage everyone's entire life. It just wanted to manage the part of life that could explode loudly. Which is why the rules focus on things like measures, weights, prices, and timing. These are the quiet levers. Change the measure, you change the meal. And of course, once you create rules, you create the gentle urge to bend them. Bakers are human, customers are human, everyone is tired. So you get small acts of creativity. Maybe a loaf is slightly lighter, but the baker insists it baked airier, as if air is a legitimate ingredient, and the customer should be grateful for the emotional spaciousness. Maybe the loaf is the correct weight at dawn, but dries out by afternoon, and suddenly the customer feels like they paid for moisture that escaped. Maybe the loaf meets the law, but the flour is mixed with cheaper grain, barley, rye, peas, so the loaf is technically bread, but also a quiet compromise. And compromises, historically, are often what people actually eat. This is where the world of bread becomes a world of types. White bread for those who can pay, darker bread for those who can't, mixed bread for those who need something filling. and a whole vocabulary of loaves that reflect class without ever stating it. Bread is honest like that. Bread doesn't need to announce inequality. It bakes it in politely. Some towns tried to regulate these categories too, not always to be cruel, but because the city wanted everything stable. If people are hungry, they get restless. If they are restless, they gather. If they gather, they complain. And if they complain, the officials have to attend meetings, which is everyone's least favorite activity, except perhaps attending meetings while hungry. So the loaf becomes an object that holds a lot of quiet negotiation. The baker negotiates with grain prices. The customer negotiates with their own budget. The city negotiates with the possibility of public anger. And hovering over all of it is the idea of the just measure, which sounds noble until you realize it requires someone to constantly check bread with a scale. It's noble, but it's also extremely practical, like nobility wearing an apron. Now let's drift gently into the ways people kept their own traditions alive within the rules. Because even when bread is regulated, people still behave like people. They develop habits. They develop small tricks. They develop quiet understandings between seller and buyer that sit just under the official system like a soft blanket. A baker might offer slightly better loaves to regular customers, not because of corruption, but because human relationships are their own currency. A customer might bring their own small container, their own cloth, their own basket, and the basket becomes part of the ritual. There's something calming about daily routines around bread. The same route, the same door, the same smell of warm crust. The same moment of pretending you are buying bread for your family and not because you personally want to eat it in. The street like a discreet medieval raccoon. And if someone is poor, the bread might be bought in smaller portions, or bought as yesterday's bread, cheaper and harder, the kind that requires determination. Stale bread has always existed quietly, like a reminder that time changes even the most comforting things. But stale bread also becomes something else. Crumbs for pottage, thickener for soup, base for something new. Which means even bread that has lost its softness can still be part of the household math. Nothing is wasted when budgets are tight, and that is a constant slow rhythm in history. There's also the strange social life of bread in public spaces. Markets have their own soundscape, soft bargaining, foot traffic, baskets, the occasional animal that did not receive the memo about personal space. Bread sits there stacked, and its presence signals stability. If the bread stalls are full, the city feels normal. If they're empty, the city feels nervous. And nervous cities invent rules faster. Sometimes rules are less about fixing a real shortage and more about calming the imagination of shortage, because the imagination is often louder than the shortage itself. This is why bread regulation shows up again and again in different forms across Europe and beyond. It's not only England. Many towns had their own ways of controlling weights and prices, especially for staples. Sometimes it's grain, sometimes it's salt, sometimes it's fuel, sometimes it's the right to bake at all, because in some places ovens were communal or controlled, and baking could be tied to fees and permissions. Imagine living in a world where your ability to produce your own bread is partly a civic arrangement. You can see how regulation spreads. Once you manage one part of survival, it's tempting to manage the rest, just to keep everything tidy. And yet, tidiness is never perfect. Standards drift. Measurements differ. People argue about what a pound means, and the pound sits there, silently, like it has no opinion, while humans yell around it. Over time, as states grew more centralized, standards became more formal, weights became more uniform, markets became more controlled, and slowly, the bread drama becomes less visible, not because it vanished, but because it moved into systems that look calmer on paper. One small, sleepy legacy that people often mention is the baker's dozen. The story, in its gentlest form, is that bakers sometimes gave 13 loaves instead of 12 to avoid penalties for short weight. Whether the exact origin is neat and provable or not, the idea is emotionally true. When the law punishes shortage, people respond with surplus as a protective charm. It's like saying, here, take an extra one so nobody has to count too hard. And that is a lovely human strategy, not heroic. Just practical kindness mixed with self-preservation. So if you ever hold a loaf today and assume it will be roughly the same size as yesterday's loaf, you are living inside a long history of people trying to stabilize that expectation. You are benefiting from centuries of arguments about scales, measures, fairness, hunger, and the exact amount of bread that should fit into a coin's worth of life. It's almost too much meaning for something you might casually toast. And now, to end softly, let's return to the warm, quiet place where this began. The bakery before dawn, the oven breathing, the flour dust still. Outside, the street is dim and calm. A town official may walk by, feeling important, not because they are powerful in a dramatic way, but because they carry the dull authority of standardization. A baker checks a loaf with a practiced hand, not out of romance, but out of habit. A customer waits, not impatiently, just patiently, the way people wait when they know the ritual will complete itself. The loaf is weighed. The coin is exchanged. The bread is carried home, tucked into cloth, held close to keep it warm. And the world continues in its most ordinary bedtime-friendly rhythm. Rules and routines, small negotiations, quiet. Hunger, quiet comfort, and the steady idea that even something as simple as bread can become a tiny public contract. Soft, warm, and heavy enough to matter. You might not expect the turning of a calendar page to feel threatening to anyone with authority, but for a surprising number of years in a surprising number of places, New Year's Eve was treated less like a harmless moment and more like a doorway that people kept using to walk into bad habits. Not dramatic bad habits, just the ordinary ones. Noise that travels too far, drinks that last too long, small gambles that feel clever at midnight, and arguments that begin as jokes and end as furniture being remembered later. And because laws are often written by people who prefer furniture to remain unremembered, the night itself sometimes became suspicious. If your room is quiet, let it stay that way. If the window hums with winter air, that's fine too. And if you feel like whispering it, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? In many towns, the problem wasn't that people enjoyed themselves. The problem was that they enjoyed themselves together, in public, at the same time, with the kind of synchronized enthusiasm that turns strangers into a crowd. Officials tended to dislike crowds the way cats dislike bathwater, not because it is always dangerous, but because it is unpredictable, loud, and full of inconvenient motion. A holiday night blurred boundaries. Apprentices and merchants stood too close. Servants laughed too freely. Someone sang the wrong song at the wrong doorstep. Someone else took it as a challenge, when it was really just a person with a cold and limited musical range. And because tomorrow is built into the holiday, the night feels like it has permission to be sloppy. The calendar flips. Mistakes feel erasable. That is a sweet idea, and also a terrifying one if your job is to keep a city quiet and taxable. So the night began to look like disorder on a schedule. Not always lawless chaos, just a soft loosening of the normal rules. Taverns stayed busy. Streets filled later than usual. People walked in groups for no practical reason except that it felt like the correct way to walk on that night. Even the air smelled different because cold air carries smoke and spilled drink in a very honest way. And somewhere, a clerk with ink-stained fingers would have to write a report the next day, explaining why the town sounded like it briefly forgot it had a bedtime. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Medieval and early modern officials tried very hard to make sure nobody was awake at midnight. And they were probably as successful as anyone has ever been at controlling human sleep schedules, which is to say, not very. But they did try, and their trying produced some wonderfully dull paperwork. A lot of the suspicion came from the moral framing of celebration. In reform-minded eras, whether we're talking about certain Protestant communities, strict civic councils, or the kind of leaders who believe joy should come with a receipt festive nights, could be treated like a test of discipline. When celebration looked like superstition, it could be labeled improper, without anyone having to define what improper actually meant. Improper is convenient. Improper is a word that folds up neatly and fits into almost any law. And once something is officially described as improper, shutting it down begins to sound like virtue, even if the only real offense was singing too loudly near a window where somebody was trying to be stern. There's a quiet irony in how often the calendar itself was used as a tool, because New Year is not as fixed as it pretends to be. Different places once began the year on different dates. March, for example, has had its moment as a very official start, which means that a January celebration could be treated as technically meaningless, or worse, a celebration of the wrong thing. And if you can argue that a holiday is not real, you can also argue that people should stop doing it. It's like telling someone their birthday is scheduled incorrectly and they should resubmit it for approval. The person will not enjoy hearing that, but the official will enjoy saying it. And then there's the practical fear. When people gather at night, you cannot easily tell what they are gathering for. A toast can become a complaint. A song can become a slogan. A firework can become an excuse to throw something else. So officials watch the night with the tired attention of someone who has seen the same problem repeat every year, like a seasonal headache that arrives with predictable timing and unpredictable intensity. Eventually, the most straightforward response was the simplest one humans have always invented for human behavior after dark: curfews. Close the taverns early, tell people to go home, patrol the square with a lantern and a serious expression, make the streets feel supervised. Curfews are the historical equivalent of an apartment building posting a sign that says quiet hours begin at 10, as if noise can read. Sometimes it works a little, mostly because people don't want trouble. Sometimes it fails completely because people are already in trouble and they haven't even noticed yet. When curfews weren't enough, authorities got creative in the most unromantic ways: fines, raids, confiscation, public warnings that didn't sound like warnings, but like disappointed parental sighs printed on paper. And because the most visible tools of celebration are also the loudest, those tools became targets. Drums, horns, fireworks, masks, anything that makes the night feel like a performance rather than a normal evening with acceptable levels of breathing. The goal was to make celebration inconvenient, not to stop time, just to make time feel boring again. And the really sleepy detail here is that enforcement wasn't always about catching the worst behavior. It was about catching enough behavior to make the rest of the city feel watched. That is how patrols work. A guard doesn't need to see every toast. They just need to be seen. The presence of a uniform, the rhythm of footsteps, the lantern glow drifting past doorways, these become part of the night's new texture. The law tries to replace festive atmosphere with administrative atmosphere. It's like turning down the music by adding paperwork to the air. But beyond curfews and patrols, there was an even calmer kind of control, changing what New Year meant in the first place. Leaders sometimes tried to shift the date, redefine the start, or insist that the true turning of the year should be marked quietly, properly, and preferably indoors with correct thoughts. A new calendar is never just math. A new calendar is a statement that the old rhythm of life is being corrected. And when you correct the calendar, you also correct people, at least in theory, which is always comforting to the sort of person who believes society is a messy desk that could be tidied if everyone would just cooperate. Of course, people rarely cooperate with the calendar when the calendar tries to remove their favorite moment. Even if public celebration is banned, the desire to mark the turning of time doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. it slides indoors. It shrinks. It becomes quieter. And in a way, that quietness can make it feel even more intimate, like the holiday is being protected rather than performed. A candle becomes a countdown. A shared drink becomes a ritual. A whispered song replaces a street parade. And it turns out humans are very good at turning almost anything into a tradition, especially if it helps them feel like the year did not simply happen to them without permission. So you get secret toasts, the kind that happen with ordinary cups in ordinary rooms, but with a deliberate pause right before midnight, as if everyone is listening for the year to change its clothes. You get small foods prepared in advance, not because the food is magical, but because eating at midnight makes the moment feel official. You get families pretending they're just staying up for practical reasons, finishing chores, waiting for someone to return, keeping an eye on the stove, while also very clearly waiting for the exact same minute they always wait for. And because suspicion makes people careful, you also get cover stories, the polite kind. Just visiting, late dinner, someone is unwell, so we're keeping them company. A kind of explanations that sound so reasonable they almost become true. It's a soft comedy, humans sitting in a room with a small secret, speaking in normal voices, inventing an ordinary reason for something that feels quietly meaningful. Sometimes the code is as simple as timing. Sometimes it's a phrase. Sometimes it's a particular knock at the right hour. A signal that you're here for the shared moment and not for anything that would require an official response. And that's the thing about banning a holiday. The holiday doesn't always die. It adapts. It learns manners. It becomes subtle. It becomes portable. The big public noise is replaced by the small private signal. And the meaning can grow stronger precisely because it is forbidden. Because forbidden things often feel more real in the mind, even when they are just ordinary things like a sip of something warm while the clock behaves normally. Meanwhile, outside, enforcement continues in its own dull way. Officials discover the limits of their energy, patrols get tired, priorities shift, winter nights are cold, and even a dedicated authority figure eventually begins to wonder if standing in the street at midnight is truly the best use of a human body. A ban that is widely ignored becomes embarrassing because it proves the state is not fully in control of time, and nothing bruises an authority's ego quite like time refusing to cooperate. So exceptions appear, the law softens around the edges. Maybe certain respectable gatherings are tolerated. Maybe churches are allowed to mark the moment in controlled ways. Maybe the patrol looks the other way if the noise is brief and polite. Maybe the city decides it would rather guide the celebration than fight it, which is a common historical compromise. If you can't stop the river, build a canal and pretend you planned the river all along. And once the night begins to return to public life, it does so slowly, like someone entering a room quietly after being told not to. The fireworks come back in some places. The bells ring again. The taverns adjust their hours with careful negotiation. The city learns, reluctantly, that people will always want to mark the boundary between before and after, even if the boundary is only symbolic. Especially if it's symbolic. Humans love symbolic boundaries. We build them everywhere. We call them beginnings, endings, resolutions, fresh starts. We use them the way we use bookmarks, even when we don't finish the book. Imagine now the last minute of the year as a quiet room rather than a loud street, because that is how it often survived, inside. The window is cold. The air is still. Someone is holding a cup they don't really need, just to have something to do with their hands. Someone else is watching a candle as if it might announce midnight politely. The clock turns, not with drama, just with that soft, ordinary movement that clocks do. The kind that has no opinion about laws or celebrations or bans. And in that gentle moment, you can hold the strange idea that celebration can be political without shouting, simply by continuing. One small toast, one shared breath, One promised to wake up and try again, not loudly, not heroically, just quietly, like a person folding a blanket in the dark. The city exhales. The authorities somewhere also exhale, because even they are tired. And the band midnight arrives anyway, calm and inevitable, like sleep, always finding a way in. Even when someone tries to keep the lights on, you might not expect a candle to have opinions about authority, but for a long time it quietly did. Not because wax is political on purpose, but because light is the one thing a city can't fully fake. If a street is bright, someone paid for it. If a room is dark, someone is saving. And if a candle burns a little faster than promised, someone is either unlucky or being gently cheated by a very respectable-looking shopkeeper with clean hands and flexible morals. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the winter air sit against the glass. Let the quiet do its quiet work. And if you feel like whispering it, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? In the older city, night arrives like a slow administrative decision. Daylight fades, and suddenly everything that was normal becomes after hours. Shops close, voices lower. The streets start to belong to fewer people. And in that shift, candles become more than background objects. They become a kind of permission. One candle means you can keep reading. 2 candles means you can pretend you're productive. 3 candles means you're either wealthy, celebrating, or you've made a mistake and will regret it when you see the bill. Light is expensive in small, steady bites, and candles are the bite-sized version of power. You can buy the night 1 inch at a time. This is why authorities cared about candles in a way that sounds absurd until you remember that governments love anything measurable. A candle is measurable. It has weight. It has length. It has a burn time that people argue about in calm, furious tones. A candle can be taxed, regulated, inspected, and discussed at meetings where everyone nods seriously while talking about wax, as if they are discussing war. And in a sleepy way, they are. It's just a war over who gets to see clearly after sunset. If you are still awake by the time we reach the part where grown adults debate the purity of tallow, feel free to subscribe. Or don't, I won't know. I'll be over here, softly watching someone in a wig pretend that candle quality is a matter of national importance. Which, to be fair, it sometimes was, because bad candles don't just ruin mood. They ruin work, safety, and the fragile dignity of people trying to write neatly in dim rooms. So imagine a market where candles are not decorative, they are essential. And because they are essential, people begin to standardize them, at least in theory. You get official ideas about what a proper candle should weigh, how thick it should be, what it should be made of, and how it should behave while burning. The dream is simple. You buy a candle, it burns as expected, and the universe remains fair. The reality is also simple. The universe does not care about fairness, and neither do some candle sellers. Beeswax is usually treated as the noble material. It smells better, burns cleaner, and looks more polite while doing it. Tallow, made from animal fat, is cheaper and more common, and it can smell like a kitchen that forgot to apologize. Both have their uses, both have their audiences, and both create opportunities for people to quietly manipulate quality. A little extra filler, a little less beeswax than advertised, a wick that isn't quite right. These are the small, boring tricks that add up, the kind of dishonesty that doesn't shout crime, but rather whispers commerce. And then come the guilds, the inspectors, the rules that sound like they were written by someone who has never met a human being with free time. In many European cities, chandlers' candle makers had organizations, standards, and, importantly, reputations. They wanted to be seen as reliable, because reliable people keep customers. But reliability also attracts regulation, because regulators love nothing more than a reliable product they can count, measure, and turn into predictable revenue. In other words, candles become part of the city's bloodstream, and the city begins to monitor them like a cautious doctor. Some rules are about safety because fire is a terrible roommate. A careless candle turns into a quiet disaster. That means authorities worry about storage, production spaces, and the kind of candle that drips too much or smokes too heavily. Other rules are about fairness, which sounds noble until you realize it's also about keeping the market stable, keeping prices from turning into chaos, and keeping the poor from being sold night at luxury rates. And then there are rules that are simply about control. Who may sell, who may produce, and who gets fined for doing it wrong. It's the usual story of a city organizing itself around a daily need, except the daily need is literally something that melts. Now drift with me into the slow mathematics of wax. Candles invite calculation because they pretend to be time. People used candles to measure hours in a loose, practical way. A candle burns down. You notice? You feel the passage of the evening in a physical form. Some households even marked candles lines, notches, small bits of metal pen so the candle becomes a kind of clock that doesn't tick. It simply disappears. There's something almost poetic about that. Time as a shrinking object. It's like your to-do list, but more honest. And because it's time, it's also discipline. Monasteries and churches had rhythms built around hours and prayers. In some places and periods, candles and lamps help structure that rhythm, especially in winter, when darkness arrives early and stays like it has rented the place. In homes too, candles become a way to enforce bedtime without saying bedtime. When the candle is low, you stop reading. When the candle is out, you stop everything. It is a very old version of the modern moment when your phone dies and you suddenly remember you have a body. Authorities love this quietly. A city that sleeps earlier is easier to govern, fewer gatherings, less noise, less chance of people standing around discussing ideas that make leaders uncomfortable. So even when governments aren't directly telling people what to do with candles, the economics of candles does some governing on their behalf. If light is expensive, the night becomes naturally quiet. The curfew doesn't need teeth. The candle price is the teeth. Of course, once a candle is tied to money and order, it becomes tied to taxes. And taxes are where boredom becomes truly majestic. You get duties on materials. You get levies on imported wax. You get regulations that make sure the right people get paid at the right time, and everyone else gets a fine. And suddenly, the candle is no longer just a candle. It is a small, edible-looking stick of bureaucracy. People respond in the way people always respond. They adapt. They ration. They stretch the night like fabric. One candle moved from room to room. One candle reserved for important work. One candle for the sick, because illness ignores budgets. Children sent to bed earlier, not because parents are strict, but because wax is expensive and small humans are not known for reading quietly anyway. And in the middle of all this, you get tiny household rituals built from necessity. The candle is lit carefully, the wick is trimmed, the flame is protected from drafts like it is a fragile little employee you can't afford to lose. You also get the sleepy comedy of candle thrift. People remelt stubs, they save drippings, they reuse what can be reused. In some homes, nothing is wasted except, possibly, everyone's patience. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the small domestic arguments. Someone used the good candle for something unimportant, like looking for a button. Someone burned too much wax while talking. Someone left a candle unattended, which is both dangerous and financially rude. And then, because humans are consistent, you get cheating. Not dramatic cheating, just the kind of cheating that thrives in regular markets. Candle makers might add impurities. Sellers might misrepresent quality. People might buy cheaper tallow candles and pretend they are beeswax at a distance, hoping nobody notices until it's too late. There were also rumors, always rumors, about counterfeit candles, about short waits, about wicks designed to burn too fast, about candles that look honest but behave like gossip spreading smoke everywhere while pretending it is not their fault. Enforcement becomes its own quiet theater. Inspectors check weights, they examine materials, they listen to complaints that sound petty until you realize they are complaints about access to the night itself. And when someone is fined for bad candles, it's not just a fine. It's a statement that the city intends to control even the small details of evening life. It's the law reaching down into your lamplit corner and saying, softly, yes, even this. But people also push back in gentle ways, not rebellions, just preferences. Some communities insist on their own traditions. Some buyers develop relationships with trusted makers. A reputation becomes valuable. The best compliment for a chandler is not, your candles are beautiful. It's, your candles are consistent, which is the kind of praise that sounds romantic only if you've ever had a candle betray you halfway through copying a letter. And through all of this, the candle keeps doing its slow work, burning, shrinking, turning a room into a small island of light. Outside, the city remains dark, with pockets of brightness where someone has decided the night is worth paying for. If you imagine walking those streets, you can picture it. A window glowing softly, a thin line of flame behind glass, a silhouette moving inside, someone reading, someone sewing, someone simply refusing to end the day just because the sun did. Later, when gas lighting and electricity arrive, the candle loses its monopoly on nighttime life, but it doesn't fully disappear. It becomes symbolic, decorative, romantic. It becomes the thing you light when you want to pretend you are not living under harsh ceiling lights and notification sounds. And that's another quiet irony. Once candles stop being necessary, they become desirable. The moment light becomes cheap, we start paying extra for the old expensive kind again, just for the feeling. So if you're lying there now, listening, maybe the modern version of candle politics is simpler. The light switch works, and you still choose dimness. You still choose soft light. You still choose a slower pace. Not because an authority told you to, but because your mind likes a gentle boundary between day and night. The candle, whether real or metaphorical, still marks that boundary. It still says, this is the quiet time. And somewhere in the background of history, a clerk is still measuring wax, an inspector is still checking weights, a shopkeeper is still insisting their candles are absolutely the correct length, and a tired household is still saving the last good one for something important like reading one more page or watching the flame for no reason at all. Or letting the room glow softly until the night feels less like darkness and more like a calm, manageable space. The candle burns down. The numbers and rules and tiny arguments fade with it. The wick leans. The flame steadies. And the city, whether it is medieval or modern, does what it always does after sunset. It becomes quieter in patches, brighter in corners, and full of people trying in small ways to control the night without waking it up too much. You might not expect a government to look at a perfectly ordinary window and think, with calm sincerity, yes, that one owes me money. But for a while, in a few places, that was exactly the vibe. Not the dramatic kind of taxation where someone storms a castle, just the gentle, paperwork-flavored kind where a clerk counts rectangles of glass and decides the sun has become a luxury item. If your room is quiet, keep it that way. Let the air settle. And if you feel like whispering it, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? The idea begins with something that sounds almost reasonable when you say it slowly. People have houses. Houses have windows. More windows usually means a bigger house, and bigger houses usually mean more money. So, in a sleepy bureaucratic leap, a window becomes a proxy for wealth, a stand-in, a little glass symbol that says, this family can afford to see outside, and because taxes love symbols, the window becomes a target. It's like taxing shoes by counting laces, not perfect, but convenient. And convenience is the true patron saint of many tax systems. If you're still awake by the time I start talking about the exact number of windows that might trigger a higher rate, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. It's honestly fine. Your eyelids are doing important work. I'm just here, softly narrating the moment in history when people argued with straight faces about whether a small opening counts as a window or merely an enthusiastic hole. So imagine an official arriving with a notebook. Not a villain, just a person with a job, a coat, and a talent for counting. They stand in front of your house and look at it the way you might look at a grocery receipt. 1, 2, 3. Upstairs 4, 5. A little attic window that you forgot existed, 6. And suddenly, your home has been converted into a number. Not the cozy number of rooms, but the taxable number of rectangles that allow light to enter your life without permission. It helps to remember that in the early modern world, light after dark was expensive, and warmth was never guaranteed, and buildings were not designed to be cheerful. Windows were genuinely meaningful. Glass was not cheap. Larger panes were not always common. People used shutters, curtains, oiled cloth, and various practical attempts at privacy and heat retention. So a window could be a status symbol, but it was also a draft, a risk, and a reminder that winter exists. Which makes the window tax feel extra odd, because it's a tax on something that is both luxury and inconvenience. Like taxing people based on how many stairs they have, because stairs imply space, but also stairs imply knees. Still, the logic persists. If you can afford windows, you can afford the state's attention. And the state, being the state, would like to be paid for its attention. Now, here's where the story becomes quietly funny in the way only policy can be. Once you tax windows, people start altering windows. Not in a glamorous architectural revolution way, but in a practical, I would like to pay less money way. If you've ever rearranged items in an online cart to avoid shipping fees, you already understand the mood. People will do small, creative things to avoid a cost that feels annoying, even if the cost is not the end of the world. Annoyance is a powerful economic force. So you begin to see houses with bricked up windows, literal bricks. Sometimes neat, sometimes not. A beautiful facade becomes a patchwork of, this used to be a window, but the government made it emotionally complicated. In some streets, you could walk along and see symmetry interrupted by solid masonry, like someone started a pattern and then got tired of paying for it. The building looks slightly sleepy itself, as if it's closing one eye to rest. It's easy to imagine the conversations. Someone says, we could keep the window and pay the tax. Someone else says, or we could not. Someone suggests a smaller window. Someone proposes moving the window to the back where it might feel less taxable, as if taxes are shy. Someone wonders whether a window that doesn't open counts. Someone else points out that the tax collector has eyes and will probably notice. And so slowly, the household reaches the brick solution. The simplest solution, the quietest solution. The one that makes the room darker and the budget calmer. This is one of those moments where the state tries to measure wealth and ends up shaping the built environment. A rule on paper becomes a change in bricks and mortar. And because buildings outlive most paperwork, the physical evidence can linger. Long after the tax is gone, the bricked up outlines remain, like fossilized tax decisions. You can see the ghosts of windows in the wall, arched shapes, rectangular frames, traces of what used to be light. There's also a softer, more human layer beneath the bricks, the daily experience of living with less light. A darker room means more candle use, more strain on eyes, more reliance on fireplaces, more small adjustments. It means reading closer to the flame, sewing by the brightest patch of day, moving chairs to follow sunlight as it travels across the floor. It turns daylight into a resource you manage consciously, like water in a drought, but gentler. And it creates odd social signals. A house with many windows might look wealthy, but it might also look taxed. A house with fewer windows might look modest, but it might also look clever, or stubborn, or simply cold. People begin to interpret facades like messages. You can almost picture neighbors casually counting each other's windows while pretending they read just admiring architecture. Lovely frontage, they might say, while doing silent arithmetic. The tax also invites the strange precision of bureaucracy. Rules tend to grow little branches. What counts as a window? Does a skylight count? What about a glass door? What about a window that is blocked from the inside? What about a window that is painted over, which feels like a window that has given up on hope? These questions create meetings, papers, arguments, and the kind of administrative energy that could have been used for almost anything else. But instead, it's used to define a window. Meanwhile, the people being taxed become experts in the edges of definitions. They learn how to exist in the gray areas. If the threshold is a certain number, they aim for one less. If a category is cheaper, they design for that category. They become amateur tax philosophers, not because they love philosophy, but because it's expensive not to be philosophical. And there's something almost tender in that. Ordinary life adapting to rules, quietly, without speeches. If you zoom out, the window tax is also part of a larger pattern. Governments looking for stable sources of revenue that are hard to hide. Income can be hidden. Goods can be smuggled. But a house is sitting there in public, minding its business. A window is not easily hidden unless you do the dramatic thing and remove the window. Which, of course, some people did. The idea that a window can be hidden by turning it into a wall is one of those very human solutions that feels both silly and completely predictable. It's also a reminder that taxes are not only about money, they shape behavior. They shape choices. They shape the way people build, renovate, and think about their own space. A home is supposed to be private, but taxes pull it into public logic. Your windows become part of your relationship with the state, like a quiet correspondence written in glass and brick. And if you want a tiny, sleepy modern analogy, it's a bit like when an app charges you per feature and suddenly you learn to live without the feature. You didn't know you could live without it, but you can. You adjust. Your habits change. You discover new ways to do old things. The difference is that with window taxes, the feature is sunlight and the subscription plan is government finance. Eventually, taxes change because everything changes. People complain, politicians shift, economic ideas move around like weather. Some taxes become unpopular. Some become seen as unfair or unhealthy. A tax on windows can be criticized for encouraging darker homes, less ventilation, more dampness, and generally the kind of indoor atmosphere that makes a room feel like it's holding its breath. Even if no one uses the word hygiene in the exact modern sense, people still notice when air feels stale and rooms feel grim. So the tax may be adjusted or repealed depending on place and time, but the larger lesson remains. A policy can accidentally redesign the world. You can write a line in a law book, and decades later, someone will live in the shadow of that line, literally, if it blocks a window. And then later still, a person walking down the street might see a bricked up patch and feel a vague curiosity, like the building is keeping a secret it doesn't even remember telling. If you picture it at night, it becomes even quieter, a street of old houses. Some windows glowing faintly, some blank places where windows would have been, smooth and dark. Inside, people move around in candlelight. A family eats close together because the brightest corner is shared. Someone reads slowly. Someone counts out coins and thinks about whether another window is worth it. Not worth it emotionally, not worth it financially, not worth it in paperwork. And all of these small choices accumulate into a city that looks a little different than it otherwise would have. And then time rolls forward, as it tends to do without asking permission. Gas lamps come, electric lights come. Windows regain their dignity. Houses get renovated. Some bricked up windows are reopened. Some are left as they are because reopening them costs money and humans are consistent. The outlines remain. The odd asymmetries remain. The quiet evidence remains. So when you think about it gently, the window tax is not just a quirky fact. It's a small meditation on how people negotiate with systems, not by shouting, mostly by adjusting, by compromising, by learning the rules well enough to bend around them. And it's also, in a strange way, a story about light, how precious it is, how obvious it is, how easily it becomes a symbol of status, and how quickly it becomes a point of control. If your eyes are getting heavy now, you can let them. You can imagine a window that is still a window, letting in a thin slice of winter daylight, and you can imagine another window that is no longer a window, just a wall with the memory of light pressed into it. You can imagine the quiet of rooms designed by budgets, the small warmth of a candle, the soft sound of wind against glass, the feeling of the night arriving and settling into corners that no longer glow. And somewhere very far away in time, a clerk is still counting. 1, 2, 3, writing it down carefully. Not because windows are exciting, but because order is. And as the numbers go into the book, the street outside remains still, and the buildings hold their shapes, and the light taxed or untaxed continues to fall where it can, slowly, softly, as if it has all night. Over time, the band begins to do what many bands eventually do when exposed to ordinary human behavior. It gets tired. Not emotionally tired, of course, because laws don't have feelings, but practically tired. Like a pair of boots that has been asked to patrol the same snowy street for the 400th night in a row. The patrol schedules start to look less heroic and more like a calendar full of sighs. The guards learn which corners are always quiet and which houses always just happen to have cousins visiting. And the authorities discover, in the softest possible way, that you can't actually stand in every doorway at midnight unless you plan to clone the entire bureaucracy, and even then the clones would probably ask for a break. When a ban is widely ignored, it becomes awkward. Not dangerous, awful, just administratively embarrassing. Like sending out an official announcement and realizing nobody read it because everyone was busy warming their hands around a small cup and quietly pretending it ice into celebration. A rule that is ignored doesn't just fail. It proves, gently and repeatedly, that the state is not fully in control of our hand. And if there is one thing institutions dislike, it is losing to a clock. So the punishment begins to soften. Exceptions appear. Someone's family supper is overlooked. Someone's late prayer meeting becomes strangely popular on the last night of the year. A few officials start using the word tolerated, which is the bureaucratic version of yawn. And slowly, the holiday walks back into public life the way a cat returns to a room after you loudly announced it wasn't tea allowed on the couch. Not all at once, not with trumpets. Just a little more noise than last year, a few more footsteps in the street, a few more candles visible behind curtains. People test the boundaries the way you test bathwater, one careful toe, then a little more. The law doesn't suddenly love joy. It just dislikes losing. So the night returns, wearing a quiet disguise of permission, and the city learns to exhale again, as if it had been holding its breath for no reason other than habit. And if you stay with that image for a moment, rules loosening like winter gloves, you can almost feel the next part arriving. The gentlest kind of midnight, not loud enough to be called a riot, just steady enough to survive. You might not expect a city to fear a calendar the way it fears a storm, but there were times when the last night of the year looked suspicious to the people in charge. Not because midnight itself was dangerous, obviously. Midnight is mostly just darkness doing its usual job. But the moment you tell a town, politely and officially, that tomorrow is a new year, Some citizens will immediately treat that as permission to behave like a small, temporary committee of chaos. So the night became a problem to manage, like a leaky roof or a chicken that has learned how to open a gate. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the quiet be the quiet. Imagine the sound of a winter window humming softly, the kind of hum you only notice when you stop trying to notice anything at all. Somewhere far off, church bells pause between hours, as if they're thinking about it. Footsteps soften on snow, not because someone is sneaking, but because snow is excellent at making everything feel like it has been turned down to a whisper. And speaking of whispers, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? You don't have to answer out loud. History is not grading you. It's just keeping you company. Now picture a town long ago, stone streets, smoke that smells like wet wood, and taverns that are technically closing at the proper hour, which is a phrase that always sounds confident until you ask who decided what proper means. In many places, New Year's wasn't seen as harmless fun. It was seen as a doorway. A doorway into drinking, noise, gambling, and sudden fights that begin over nothing and end over slightly less than nothing. Officials disliked how the night blurred class lines, turned strangers into crowds, and made the word tomorrow feel negotiable, like a price at a market stall. When everyone agrees that time is changing, even for 1 minute, people begin to act as if rules are also changing, which is the sort of thing a rule maker notices, the way a cat notices a cupboard door left open. There is also the simple fact that celebrations are messy. They leave evidence. They leave spilled ale, broken candles, the mysterious disappearance of a neighbor's good spoon. They leave singing that does not improve with enthusiasm. And they leave that peculiar social energy where everyone suddenly has an opinion about someone else's behavior. The authorities, being authorities, often preferred nights that did not have opinions. A quiet night is easier to govern. A quiet night is a night where the calendar has no heartbeat. So the calendar itself became a tool of control. If you can regulate the night, you can regulate the mood of a city. And if you can regulate the mood, you can regulate the morning, which is really what power likes to do, reach forward into tomorrow and rearrange it slightly. Of course, the objections were rarely framed as we dislike joy. It was usually something more wholesome, like public order, or moral health, or the prevention of idleness, which is a favorite phrase because it makes rest sound suspicious. Reform movements often treated festive nights as improper customs, especially when they smelled like older customs. Something about a loud communal midnight feels pagan to certain people, even if no one is summoning anything except a second round of drinks. In some eras, authorities pushed plain living, quieter streets, stricter Sundays, and a general vibe of please stop being festive in public, and the party night became an easy target. If celebration looked like superstition, it could be framed as decay rather than tradition. Once it's framed that way, shutting it down starts to sound like virtue, which is a very efficient disguise. You can imagine the sermons that might follow, the ones that list every possible sin in a soothing order, as if they're sorting laundry, drinking, gambling, dancing, singing loudly, wearing masks, laughing at the wrong time. Laughing at the right time, but with the wrong people. And somewhere in the middle of this, you find a strangely tender truth. The authorities were nervous because the night made people feel equal, even for a few hours. In the dark, everyone is mostly just a shape in a coat. A midnight crowd is a temporary republic of breath and footsteps. And that is charming, but it is also inconvenient. If you were still awake by the time we reach the part where someone confiscates a drum like it as a dangerous weapon, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I'll never know. The people who tried to ban New Year's probably wouldn't have subscribed either. They would have sent a letter, sealed it with wax, and complained that the channel encourages excessive mirth, which is, honestly, a wonderful phrase because it makes happiness sound like a spill you should mop up. So how do you ban a midnight? You do it the way you ban anything that humans enjoy. You add paperwork. The simplest method is a curfew. Close the taverns early, patrol the squares, make gathering feel risky. Curfews are not particularly poetic, but they are repetitive, and repetition is one of the strongest tools in governance. You also add fines. Not enormous ones, necessarily, sometimes just enough to sting. Enough to make someone think, sleepily, maybe we'll celebrate quietly this year. Cities use fines, raids, public warnings, and the kind of enforcement that relies on embarrassment. Because embarrassment can be cheaper than prison, and it spreads faster. And the authorities learned to target the tools of celebration. Fireworks, when they existed, or any equivalent loud thing that announces itself. Drums, horns, bells rung at the wrong moment. Even masks, because masks are suspicious on principle. A masked person is someone who might behave differently from their daytime self, and that's an alarming concept if your job is maintaining predictability. So the night becomes a kind of inventory list. What objects make a holiday visible? What objects make it audible? What objects make it impossible to deny? If you can remove those objects, you can pretend the holiday never arrived. You can stand in the street, hear nothing, and tell yourself that the calendar is under control. Sometimes this was paired with a cleverer strategy. Redefine what New Year even means. If people gather because it is January 1st, then perhaps you move the official New Year to a different date. If they gather at midnight, perhaps you insist midnight is not the important moment. A new calendar isn't just math. It's a statement that the old rhythm of life is over. And when people keep celebrating the old midnight anyway, it becomes a small act of defiance, even if they're not thinking about politics at all. Sometimes they just want the comfort of a familiar moment, but comfort can look like rebellion if it refuses to be rescheduled. The strange thing is that calendars have always been more flexible than people pretend. Different regions use different systems. Different churches and governments recognize different New Year days. In some places, the year began in March, and others it shifted after reforms. And through all of it, ordinary people tended to keep using the moment that felt real to them. The law might say, the year changes on this date. The people might shrug and light a candle on the date their grandparents used. It is like someone changing the name of a street and expecting every local to forget what it used to be called. The sign changes. The habits do not. And when public celebration is banned, the party moves indoors. Not dramatically, just quietly. It becomes smaller, softer, more personal. A candle becomes a countdown. A shared drink becomes a ritual. A whispered song replaces a street parade. The energy compresses like steam in a kettle that is trying very hard not to whistle. People learn to celebrate without evidence because the safest festivity is the one that leaves no trace. That does not mean they feel heroic about it. It just means humans are good at making warmth in small rooms. They are good at turning ordinary objects into meaning. A bowl of nuts, a piece of bread, a ribbon saved from last year, a chair pulled closer to the fire. There is something almost comically careful about it. Someone might say, we're not celebrating. We're just staying up, which is a sentence that sounds innocent until you notice everyone is staying up together at the same hour with the same suspiciously festive snacks. A family might invent a polite cover story. Late dinner, just visiting, a cousin passing through, a neighbor stopping by to return a borrowed pot. And the cover story becomes part of the tradition, like wrapping paper you reuse because it's still in good condition. Small customs become code. A certain food, a certain phrase, a knock at the door at the right hour. The holiday survives by becoming subtle, a tradition carried in the pocket. And while we're being unnecessarily specific, we should linger on the small details that make a secret midnight feel real. The way a room smells after the lamps have been lit for hours. The slightly stale warmth of bodies gathered close. The soft clink of cups placed down gently so they won't betray you to the street. The way someone checks the window, not because they expect trouble, but because checking a window is a ritual of anxiety that makes you feel prepared. The way laughter becomes a controlled substance. Tiny doses, taken carefully so you don't attract attention or wake the children who, ironically, are often the reason the holiday is being kept alive at all. If you've ever tried to be quiet in a house where the floorboards disagree with you, you already understand half the history of band celebrations. A floorboard can be more loyal to the authorities than any guard. It announces your movement with a squeak that sounds like a confession. So people learn new roads through their own homes. They step where the wood is firm. They avoid the hallway that always complains. They carry their joy like contraband, which is a ridiculous thing to have to do, and yet here it is quietly happening. Eventually, though, the band begins to do what many bands do when exposed to ordinary life. It gets tired. Not emotionally tired, because laws don't have feelings, but practically tired, like a pair of boots asked to patrol the same icy street for the 100th night in a row. Enforcement gets bored. Priorities shift. Officials discover that you can T-patrol every home at midnight unless you plan to turn the entire city into one long hallway with one long guard at each end. And even then, someone would find a way to celebrate quietly in the middle, probably with a candle and an extremely innocent expression. A widely ignored ban becomes embarrassing because it proves the state is not fully in control. And if there is one thing authority dislikes, it is losing to a clock. So rules soften, exceptions appear. Permits, in some places, become a way of admitting defeat politely. A private gathering is tolerated. A public one is discouraged, but not always punished. A few loud fireworks might be ignored because the official on duty is cold and would rather go home. The holiday walks back into public life slowly, the way a shy animal returns to a yard once it realizes the fence isn't actually electrified. And then, almost without anyone officially announcing it, the night becomes normal again. Not perfectly normal. People keep their habits of secrecy for a while, like someone who still whispers after leaving a quiet library. But the streets begin to accept footsteps. Bells ring again, sometimes on purpose. The idea of counting down becomes less suspicious. The law does not suddenly love joy. It just dislikes losing. And in that slow surrender, you can see something gently human. Celebration is hard to erase because it isn't a single action. It's a rhythm. It's a decision to notice time passing and to mark it with something warm. So imagine the last minute of the year as a quiet room rather than a loud street, because that is how it often survived. Imagine someone holding a cup and not even making a toast, just holding it like a small anchor. Imagine a shared breath, a small promise to wake up and try again, not in a heroic way, just in the ordinary way people continue living. If the world outside is cold, the room is warmer by a few degrees, and that difference feels important. The clock turns. The city exhales, and the band midnight arrives anyway, not crashing through the door, not shouting, just slipping in on soft feet as if it has always belonged there. And if you stay with that image, one candle, one quiet cup, one careful laugh, there's no need to end strongly. The year changes the way it always does, in small increments, while most of history keeps dozing. The streets settle. The windows hum. Somewhere a bell waits politely for the next hour, and you can let your mind drift because the night has been argued over for centuries and still remains, steady and unhurried like a calendar page turning itself in the dark.